Mzansi Africa, on the final day of Pride Month, we reflect on the spate of violence against the LGBTQIA+ community and discuss what DA governments are doing to help the community get equal justice and dignity. We also ask the question, what more can be done? And in a special feature this week, we'll address yesterday's bombshell Constitutional Court judgment, sending Jacob Zuma to jail. But first, we take a look at the weekend headlines.
Zuma has been found guilty of contempt of court by the Constitutional Court earlier on today and has received a 15-month jail term.
For the next 14 days, the sale of alcohol, whether for on-site or off-site consumption, is banned, and schools are closing and the curfew has been adjusted.
The Western Cape is bracing for its third wave, and it seems it is prepared, but Gauteng is definitely buckling under the pressure.
This is the part where government needed to also acknowledge some of the failures within government in terms of delivering to the South Africans, because we had really hinged a lot of hope around the vaccination for the longest time.
We set out to create a non-partisan event, a summit in the interests of all of South Africa's people.
This is not just about firearms, and this has been discussed today. This is about the limitation of individual rights and freedoms versus what the state perceives to be in the public interest.
This week in the headlines, South Africa enters level 4 lockdown and the Constitutional Court rules on Zuma. Once more, we find ourselves under lockdown level 4. Unfortunately, these never-ending lockdowns will be part of our lives until the ANC government does what it has failed to dismally do up until now, which is to secure and administer enough vaccines to bring this pandemic to an end. Make no mistake, this third lockdown is a direct result of government failure and has catastrophic results for ordinary South Africans. Every COVID death and every job lost due to this pandemic and irrational restrictions are on President Ramaphosa. We are now paying the price for his administration's vaccines failure. The DA will be holding government accountable for this failed vaccination program, and yesterday the DA leader John Steenhuisen reached out to all vaccine manufacturers to urge them to open up access to the private sector and capable provincial governments so that we can speed up rollout and we can begin to save lives. Arguably, one of the biggest stories this week is the judgment handed down by the Constitutional Court, which found Zuma guilty of contempt of court and sentenced him to 15 months in jail. Now, this is quite important because it's 15 months of an unsuspended sentence, which means he actually has to go to jail. Let's take a closer look at this explosive story and the long road that has brought us to this point.
Corruption's estimated by South Africa's government to have cost the economy $700 billion. For many, former President Jacob Zuma is the symbol of that corruption.
Zuma was charged in 2007 for his alleged involvement in the controversial arms deal and accused of using his political influence to secure contracts for convicted fraudster Schabir Shaik. The High Court in Pretoria is hearing the next leg of the DA's 6-year-long so-called spy tapes battle to have fraud and corruption charges reinstated against the president.
The Democratic Alliance finally have the so-called spy tapes. The recordings were used to drop fraud and corruption charges against President Jacob Zuma in 2009.
Zuma lost his legal bid to stop the DA from getting the tapes in the Supreme Court of Appeal. The DA is now gearing for another legal battle to have the 2009 decision reviewed.
Nobody in South Africa, whether that person is the President of South Africa or the person living on the street, is above the law. The law applies equally to everyone.
The arms deal case against former President Jacob Zuma is back at the Pietermaritzburg High Court. The former president is facing charges of corruption, money laundering and fraud.
Former President Jacob Zuma has been ordered to appear and testify before the State Capture Commission.
And Zuma has been implicated by several witnesses who've already testified, and his name has also cropped up when issues relating to the Gupta family arose.
Former President Jacob Zuma is defying a constitutional court order to appear before the State Capture Commission.
Zuma's walkout was a calculated act of defiance and a willful visible display of contempt for the rule of law. Jacob Zuma's new excuses for not wanting to appear before the state capture inquiry are simply unconvincing.
The state capture inquiry will apply to the Constitutional Court to have Jacob Zuma charged with contempt of court.
Former President Jacob Zuma, who's 79 years old, has been sentenced to direct imprisonment.
Zuma has been found guilty of contempt of court by the Constitutional Court.
Former President Jacob Zuma has been sentenced to 15 months imprisonment, unsuspended. He has to report to a police station of his choice, either in Nkandla, KZN, or somewhere in Johannesburg by Sunday, failing which the Minister of Police, Breytenbach, and the National Commissioner of Police, Quintas, must ensure within 3 days from Sunday that he does make his way to prison.
Former President Jacob Zuma will report to the police station, will go to a correctional facility. There are no two ways about it.
No one is above the law, not even a former president.
And that is that came out of the Constitutional Court yesterday. John, I want to speak to you about this. It's been a long road for the Democratic Alliance, and this is a landmark judgment in many, many ways. Could you talk us through about where we come from with this matter?
Well, I think we've come from a situation where we had a complete abuse of power by President Zuma and those around him. And I think that's the important point, to protect him from facing justice on so many occasions, whether it was the arms deal, whether it was the 783 charges of fraud, corruption, racketeering. He's done everything he could to avoid his day in court, despite telling everyone that all he wants is his day in court. I think yesterday's judgment was a victorious blow for the Constitution, for the rule of law, but also for the South African people, because it sends a very strong message out saying it doesn't matter how well you're connected, you are subject to the same law as the rest of us, and that equality before the law is important. So we look forward to having the second part of this, the 783 charges of fraud, corruption, and racketeering, heard as well, and Mr. Zuma must appear in court. And hopefully this lesson is going to send a very clear message out to all of those involved in government level who think that they can act with impunity, that the long arm of the law will eventually reach up with them, and the wheels of justice may turn slowly, but they do turn, and they're going to find themselves underneath it.
A lot of people are saying, oh, this is rather odd. I mean, like, here's somebody who has over 700 charges, leveled against him, and then he gets to go to jail for being in contempt of court. A little bit like a serial killer being jailed for a traffic fine. But, I mean, why is this quite important, though?
Well, I think this is important because it establishes that precedent that it doesn't matter who you are. You can be a former president who still enjoys wide support within his own party, but the law applies to you. And if you're guilty, you will face the same sentence. Now, this was the contempt of court side of a case. The more serious side of the case around the 783 charges of fraud, corruption, racketeering still need to be heard. And we're convinced that justice must be done. And if we look at the genesis of that, it was all about abuse of power. Much like the president showed contempt for the Constitutional Court, he showed utter contempt for the law, the people of South Africa, as well as his constitutional obligation to uphold the law of the Republic of South Africa when he got involved in all these activities, and then set about appointing directors of the NPA and key people in the prosecuting authority to protect himself from ever having to go to court. That house of cards has come tumbling down, and he is now exposed. And I think this is going to be the first of a series of cases that him and other high-profile ANC people are going to have to face.
Glynnis, you are our shadow minister for justice in the Democratic Alliance. If you had to explain to somebody at home, what does this judgment mean? I mean, I think a lot of people want to understand, will Jacob Zuma be in an orange suit?
Hi, sir. Yes, well, certainly Jacob Zuma will be in an orange suit. He has been convicted. He doesn't have the option of a fine. It is not a suspended sentence. And so he must go to jail. He has been given 5 days to hand himself over to the nearest correctional facility, either in Nkandla or the Pretoria Central Police Station, and he must do that. If he fails to do that, the Constitutional Court has given an instruction to the Commissioner of Police to ensure that he is arrested and presented to the nearest correctional facility. So he has no choices. He's run out of tarmac finally. and he will either hand himself over or he will be arrested, like any other person who evades serving their sentence. He will be arrested and delivered to prison, where he will begin serving his sentence in an orange overall.
Yeah. And I mean, Glynnis, a lot of people are saying this is a massive victory for our institutions, including the Constitution and the rule of law. And it's I suppose it all boils down to the precedent that has just set. And so, I mean, the Constitutional Court was quite clear yesterday about what this all meant.
Well, it's a massive victory for the criminal justice system. It's a massive victory for law in South Africa. Is a massive victory for the rule of law. So we live in a constitutional democracy, as John has said, and as James said in the clip. Every person in South Africa is equal before the law. That has been quite hard to believe up to now, because Zuma has ducked and dived accountability in the most astonishing fashion for the past 2 decades. But now he has the Constitutional Court was clearly incensed in a strong judgment. Justice Kampepe said this was, one of the most egregious examples of contempt of court that one could imagine.
Yeah.
A former president who is supposed to provide an example for the rest of South Africa, for other South Africans, thumbing his nose at the Constitution and at the apex court. It's unthinkable. It's absolutely unthinkable. And the Constitutional Court made it very clear yesterday what they think about that kind of behavior and what kind of consequences will be visited upon you if you behave in that fashion. A 15-month jail sentence is no laughing matter, believe me. It must be the most serious sentence ever delivered on contempt of court. And it speaks volumes for what the position is going to be going forward, both for Zuma and for all of the people who helped prop up his rotten regime.
Absolutely. And John, lastly to you, I mean, a lot of people will say, does this mean, that really the good ANC is now flexing its muscle within the organization? Does this mean the end of corruption in the ANC?
Well, first of all, this has got nothing to do with the ANC. I mean, the ANC protected this self-same man for 2 decades. They protected him in Parliament, they protected him in court, they protected him outside the courts. Let's not be under any illusion this has got anything to do with a will on behalf of the ANC. This was the Zondo Commission of Inquiry set up by the Public Protector of South Africa. She directed that the commission must take place. A contempt shown for that commission, and now sentence. The big disappointment I have out of this is that Zuma's not going to testify at Zondo. I think it would have been important for him to testify at Zondo, because I think he would have been able to spill the beans on exactly in his inner circle and people around him, including his then deputy president, now current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, who knew what, when and how. Because I think the president likes to portray himself as having been separate from Zuma. He served as his deputy, both in the organization and around the cabinet table. It is inconceivable. You must have been asleep in cabinet meetings to have been unaware of the scale of what was happening. And, it's no good just being shocked. Yeah. You should have done something about it. Yeah. So I wanted to hear when President Ramaphosa knew what was going on, what he did about it at cabinet meetings, and what he did about it to fight corruption. Because all I saw of President Cyril Ramaphosa over those periods was a man slavishly defending Jacob Zuma at every single turn.
Yeah. And of course, we would have also just failed to uphold the Constitution, to uphold the Constitution, had he not acted in himself and had he not said, I took an oath to protect the Constitution on behalf of the people of South Africa, but I did nothing. And now he makes us believe that he's shocked about this.
Yeah, but he said in Parliament, Jacob Zuma is a great president. I mean, and now you'll battle to find a Zuma supporter in the Ramaphosa wing. They were all cheerleaders of Zuma during those years. They relied on him for their patronage. They relied on him for their positions. And I can tell you right now that when the truth outs, as it always does, I think that we're going to see a very different role played by Mr. Ramaphosa to the one he likes to portray to the public, that he's a cleaning up, cleaning out kind of guy, and he never got his hands dirty. He was at the heart of the machinery that was driving state capture in South Africa. And for him to try and divorce himself from that period in South African life, I think is going to be very, very difficult. And I'm sure that, and which is why I wanted to hear what Mr. Zuma had to say, I'm sure that Mr. Zuma would be able to place Mr. Ramaphosa at the heart of some of those decisions. Particularly, I mean, this was a man that Zuma put in charge of turning around the state-owned entities. Many of this state-owned entity collapse happened on Mr. Ramaphosa's watch. Mr. Ramaphosa was put in charge of a variety of programs and policies in government, including Eskom. And, we saw what happened. But I think that what yesterday's judgment does do is that, it's going to be, a single swallow doesn't make a summer, but it's a great start. And I think there's some people in the ANC who must be very worried now about, about where this thing is heading.
And lastly, John, on this, this has been, also a massive victory for the DA that started this journey long time ago.
Well, I remember the outrage and absolute venom spewed by the media when we hung up those Stop Zuma posters. You may recall them, the Stop Zuma
campaign.
Now, if South Africa had listened to us then, we would have probably avoided these 9 years of state capture and harassment. We were vilified for putting up those posters. Well, almost a decade later, every South African was marching on the street demanding what we did. But we didn't. But despite that criticism from the media, despite our opponents and undermining us, we doggedly continued to stand up for the rule of law. We've doggedly pursued the spy tapes. We doggedly pursued the reinstating of the 783 charges of fraud, corruption, and racketeering, not because, it's a nice thing to do, because it is the right thing to do by the people of South Africa who've entrusted us to help protect and defend the rule of law and the Constitution. And I can tell you right now, till the last dog dies, this party that we are part of, and the party which I'm lucky to lead, is going to be at the forefront of bringing the corrupt to justice in South Africa. There is nowhere to hide from the DA. Just ask Menzi Simelane, just ask Hladi Motsoeneng, just ask Jacob Zuma. If you do wrong things, we will come for you, and we will find you, and we will make sure that you do have your day in court and that you're brought to justice, because that's what the South African people deserve. A party that stands up for them against politicians and others who think that they are above the law.
Absolutely. Thank you very, very much. And thank you, Glynnis, for the work that you are doing. I know that as somebody who used to be in the criminal justice system yourself, this is probably a very great affirmation that our institutions, in spite of the abuse that they've endured, are still able to stand firm.
Absolutely. So, yes, it's very gratifying to see that the criminal justice system is very, very slowly getting back on its feet, that it still functions, that the courts continue to be the bastion that they have been for the last 2 decades when everything else was crumbling. And now it's up to the National Prosecuting Authority, the Special Investigation Unit, the Asset Forfeiture Unit, and particularly the Independent Directorate, to start prosecuting people. A lot of information is now out there. The investigative journalists have done a magnificent job. The Zondo Commission has been quite fabulous. And now the NPA needs to start prosecuting and producing some convictions so that South Africans can get the satisfaction of consequences for what is really very, very poor behavior.
Absolutely.
Just one final point, because I think it ties into the next big battle that we got. I think citizens can now see the importance of a constitution and a constitutional court. At every single time when the politicians have abused power, the constitution and the constitutional court have been the backstop that have ensured that justice prevails. Which is why we must not tinker with the constitution. We must not amend it willy-nilly, because it still remains the South African citizens' best protection against abuse of power.
And it doesn't matter who is part of the executive. If the Constitution reigns supreme, then we can be confident that we're protected.
That we are protected, correct.
Now we're going to be moving on to the Spotlight feature for this week. As Pride Month draws to a close, we reflect on the horrific spate of violence attacks against the LGBTQIA plus community. Let's take a look at this story in the Spotlight.
June is Pride Month. It's a month where we remember the struggles of people in the LGBTQI+ communities for their place in society.
South Africa has some of the most progressive laws in the world. In fact, it was the first country in the world to protect against discrimination based on sexual orientation.
South Africa is the only African country where gay marriage is actually legal, but elsewhere, those in the LGBTQ community live with daily discrimination, facing abuse.
Gay rights remain a major challenge in some parts of Africa where discrimination is rife. Now, in countries like Uganda, it's even a criminal offense.
This means that in some countries, loving someone of the same sex could either land you in prison or even cost you your life.
These two men from Malawi were sentenced to 14 years in prison in 2010 for publicly declaring that they wanted to marry. The Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act officially authorises abuses against LGBT people.
Violent attacks on members of South Africa's lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender communities are continuing. Reports show that 1 in 4 South Africans know someone who's been murdered because of their sexual orientation.
Our society's changed, maybe in some areas, but there's still so much work to do. It's still not safe to be gay.
Today marks the end of International Pride Month, and it's necessary to reflect on how far we have come in creating a safe and equal space in South Africa for the LGBTQIA+ community. Pride Month braces and traces its origins back from the 60s following the Stonewall riots in New York City, where members of this community were harassed and raided. Since then, the month marks worldwide the fight for this community to enjoy equal rights and afforded the dignity that we all deserve. Despite South Africa having some of the most progressive laws in the world, the reality is that people are still attacked for their sexual orientation. Daily, we hear of horrific stories of people being harassed, mutilated, and killed in their own communities. Hate crimes are still pervasive. Corrective rape, especially among black queer women, still happens daily. Why is this the case? What needs to change? This cannot just be solved by rainbow flags and pride marches. Much more needs to happen. The law is simply not enough. We need a radical cultural change and a cultural shift in South Africa. To this end, I will be introducing a private member's bill in Parliament which will seek to outlaw the horrific practice of gay conversion therapy. We want to amend the Children's Act so that it can criminalize any organization or individual who will subject children to this barbaric act. We have to give effect to the Constitution, which states explicitly that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, and we all enjoy the same rights under the law. We are not safe until we are all safe. To discuss all of this and more, we are joined in studio by DA leader John Steenhuisen, the chairperson of the DA Metro LGBTQIA+ community, Roberto Quintas, and DA member of Parliament, Zakhele Mbhele. On Zoom, I am joined by Zintle Olayi, who is the LGBTQIA+ community activist and one of our great activists within the Democratic Alliance. John, let me start off with you. The reality is that it is still not safe to have a different sexual orientation in South Africa. Why is that the case? Is it a legislative issue? Is it a cultural issue?
I think it's a mixture of both. Although we have one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, which entrenches the right of people to choose who they love and to live the life that they want to live, we still have a big cultural divide across a variety of communities where, being gay, being a member of the LGBTQIA+ community is frowned upon. It is, it is not seen as normal, and therefore people are being discriminated against. I happen to know this from personal experience. I have a sister who is a member of the LGBTQIA+ community. She's a mother, she's a wife, but still, it's not easy for this community to, live life without people, looking oddly at, and I think that there's some cultural issues around it, but I think that what we have to do is to start finding ways to show that actually, we have a constitution that protects people and the law has to protect people. Too much we're seeing black lesbian females being raped in communities and terrible. I come from KwaZulu-Natal. This is a practice that happens far too often there. You've heard about this conversion therapy that's going on. There's just too much of this going on. And the law needs to be amended, and that's why I'm very glad you're bringing that bill to make sure that we criminalise that type of behaviour, to entrench the rights that are defined in the Constitution.
Absolutely.
So the Constitution sets out the macro right and the basic human right. The legislation needs to provide the filling out of that, to make sure that those rights are not just written down in the Constitution, but that they are realised.
Yeah. Quickly, why is it important for the DA as a Liberal Party to be at the forefront of this fight?
Because as a Liberal Party, we believe in the right of you to be you, to choose who you love, to worship the God you want to worship, to live your life the way in which you want to be. The fundamental principle of liberalism is free to be me.
Yeah.
I am who I am. I'm an individual in my own right. I'm not an envoy or proxy of a race, of a gender, of a class, of a religion. I am me.
Yeah.
And what I can offer South Africa, needs to be tested, not who I love, who I worship, who I live with, and how my life unfolds.
And the big thing, Zach and Rob, also is that we believe in as a Democratic Alliance is that I don't have to be part of a particular group of people for me to fight for your right to be who you want to be.
Absolutely, because if your approach is principled, right, it means that you will defend and uphold that principle, be it individual freedom, be it equality, regardless of your background and regardless of whose rights are being violated. So the fact that I'm a gay black man does not mean I need to be a voice for gay black men necessarily. I will be myself, and those who identify will identify, but I will also speak out for different groups, different demographics, as is in line with my convictions.
Absolutely. Rob, I mean, there has been, particularly over the past, I think, maybe 6 weeks, there's been a spate of violent crimes. When I mean violent, and we've seen this before, I mean, this is not the first time, of violent crimes happening not just around the country, but particularly in some of the communities where we govern. What are some of the things that needs to happen? John spoke about legislative reform that is met exactly by a cultural shift as well. What do we need to do?
So I think it's really important that our communities, from leadership in communities all the way down to your person on the street, to learners at various levels in school, begin to become sensitized to who the person is that they are supposedly going to be naturally discriminatory towards because of what they've been taught, either through religion or through cultural ideologies. And I think that when one humanizes the letters in the LGBTQIA plus acronym, it becomes a way of actually defining people. And as a Liberal Party, naturally, we believe in the rights of the individual to be themselves. There's nothing criminal in loving someone of the same gender. Unfortunately, the taboos and the dogmas that exist around this leave many of our LGBTQIA plus or queer folk in an incredibly vulnerable space where they become the scapegoats very often for the misguided anger towards various issues that people have. And where we govern, naturally, where we govern outright here in the city of Cape Town, in terms of local government, we sensitize our first responders, so to speak, in terms of our social workers, our law enforcement, Metro Police, and those that are coming into contact with those who may be in the space of trauma. More must be done by the South African Police Services especially. I know that the policies all exist. But once again, as with our Constitution, which we must continue to defend, what is written on paper is not always written in people's hearts. And unfortunately, the lived reality of many of our particularly our trans people, is quite different to what is written on paper.
No, absolutely. And of course, I mean, then, if you don't sensitize your first responders, what can happen is that you can re-traumatize people. It can be secondary abuse, right? From whatever they're running away from, people can re-abuse them because of the very nature of not being sensitized.
Exactly that.
Yes, now I was going to say, if I can then just springboard from what Rob is saying, and to tie it to the larger issues that are always raging in the public discourse in this country, is that we have fantastic policies and laws on paper, but as Rob says, it's not translating into lived reality. And that's because we do not have the effective management and the institutional capacity of the different agencies and departments that are meant to be upholding and enforcing the rights and services that are guaranteed to LGBTQIA people. So a quick example is that, there was a parliamentary question a few years back that found that the majority of Home Affairs officers did not have marriage officers who had indicated that they would perform same-sex civil marriages.
Yeah.
So we can have the civil marriage provision on paper, but if most people will go to their nearest Home Affairs office and they can't actually get married, then the gap is
and it's a huge gap, right? Because I mean, the Civil Union Act is from 2006, and I mean, you sit years later, and in practice, people can't still access these services.
Quite right.
Yeah, I want to bring in Zintle here, speaking about the issue around having something on paper versus the lived experience. Zintle, talk to us. I mean, I would love to hear from you, particularly the lived experience of Black queer women in our communities and some of the horrific experiences some people experience.
Thank you for having me. So I'd like to speak about, firstly, simple things such as discrimination in the workplace, where you go to make a living and to make money and to put bread on the table, but where you're still able, where you still face discrimination from your colleagues or from your superiors. And then I'd like to speak about an issue that is very sensitive, which is corrective rape, where men feel that they are able to turn women who are lesbians into being straight by raping them. So there are a lot of things that we face here on the ground. Like, for example, access for trans people, access to gender-affirming surgeries. That is another thing that is accessible, or a thing that one is able to, get to. So there are things, but they vary in terms of the intensity, or rather how important they are within the community. Those are just some of the things that I have written down, and most of the things that you're referring to are things that John, Rob, and Zach mentioned in the comments below.
Zintle, I mean, the reality is that I, as a straight Black woman in this country, daily, I know that my life is not safe. But it's nowhere near what it is like to be, a woman, or even somebody who doesn't identify my gender, who lives in our communities in South Africa. There's an added extra layer of being completely unsafe, being targeted for your sexual orientation in a way that even I, as a woman who's vulnerable in South Africa, it's almost multiplied.
Yes, that's yeah. Yes, it's another layer of oppression that exists for queer Black women, especially queer Black women who live in townships or in locations, where you're faced with safety issues, for example. And it's difficult for a woman alone already, a Black woman, to walk at night. But if you're queer and you're a Black woman who's walking at night, it's even more difficult. So those are just some of the things that we are faced with, that we live with. And then I think that we need to, focus mainly on education, and education from a primary level, where children are from a young age educated about particular things pertaining to the LGBTI community, so that we are able to then address the ignorance factor that comes to or that comes with dealing with our community. And I think that people as a whole in general, as a person, it is your responsibility to educate yourself and to learn and to sensitize yourself about things that we face in the community. Things like, for example, like learning about pronouns, or like learning about gender identity, or things that people who seem or who say that they are allies could do to show support and solidarity pertaining to the things that we face on a daily basis. Yes.
And also, just before, any one of you can jump in here, but before I even let you go, the other thing is that, as you say, we've got to do the work amongst ourselves, and we've got to also just, our activism can't just be limited, during June when it's, fashionable to wear a flag and, build a float. But I mean, these are real things. These are real people. People's lives are in danger, and we've got to do more.
After you, Zach.
Thanks, John. And so the sad thing is that the kind of interventions and efforts that Zintle is pointing to that should happen and would help, there already is a sort of theory or a sort of concept framework for it in the form of the National LGBTI Task Team that was formed way back in 2009.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be this multi-agency forum with the Justice Department as the lead departments, all other departments, health, education, etc., that are relevant are on board there. They're meant to have provincial forums, bring civil society, and then drive and see through all of these interventions that would be public education, awareness raising, making sure that the public healthcare system is geared, the police, etc. But we're not seeing the effective implementation.
Yeah.
We're not seeing the follow through.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing. That's why I'm very proud of this party. And it's not good enough just to talk about it in a month. And I think you're going to see a lot of politicians from across the political spectrum putting on the flag and giving this attention. Juxtapose that with the DA, which takes up this issue 365 days a year, whether it's Martin Meyer and Kaylee Lang in Durban, they're setting up safe spaces and DA offices for the queer community to be able to come in and have a safe space to be able to access municipal and government services, to the incredible work being done by Malcolm and his team in Tshwane around shelters, particularly in township areas for people who are vulnerable like Zintle, to actively involving in pride issues and creating safe spaces, to the incredible work done by where we govern in places like the Western Cape, where we light up Table Mountain, and we have these ongoing programs throughout the year. Now, it's very easy to talk the talk. It's another thing to walk the walk, and I'm very proud to lead a party that walks the walk all year round, not just during Pride Month.
And Zintle, we had a conversation the other night about particularly how important shelters are, in that, like, sometimes, somebody can be chased out of home because if they come out to their parents, and then they have absolutely nowhere to go.
Exactly. And when we look at Pride shelters, particularly in Cape Town, you'll find that in Cape Town there's one shelter that exists that caters to the queer community, which is Pride Shelter. And the Pride Shelter is understaffed, and in most cases they don't have resources to cater to everybody. You know what I mean? So then, yes, there's a place to go, but however, I get to the Pride Shelter and I'm not able to get a bed to sleep or a warm meal because the Pride Shelter is full. So I think that we need to also particularly focus on creating more spaces that are accessible to the queer community in cases such as, for example, being chased away from home because you found the community. There are so many things that are.
Yeah, but I mean, here's the thing. I mean, Rob, I know you do a lot of work with the Pride Shelter. That clearly, it has been a massive success. But it obviously, we could do more because we would want to do more.
So it's actually interesting that Zintle raised this, because on Saturday afternoon, from the lunch table, via WhatsApp, I was able to secure a bed in the same Pride Shelter that Zintle referred to for a young person from Mitchell's Plain who had been assaulted by his own father and had nowhere to go and feared for his life staying at home and had nowhere to turn. So one of our constituency heads from that area gave me a call on the Saturday afternoon and said how and where and what and who. I sent a WhatsApp to the manager at the shelter and said, do you have bed space? There's a person that needs help. She said, give me his name. You can give him my number. And by the afternoon, I got a confirmation that he had arrived safely at the shelter. So that shelter is a really interesting discussion, and I'm going to try not spend too much time on it. But it is in a City of Cape Town-owned building, Old Victorian House in Oranizicht, which for more than a decade has been leased at an absolutely nominal subsidized rate. initially to the Pride Shelter Trust, now to Al Fitra. So it is not operated by the City of Cape Town, but the property is supplied
By the city.
Excuse the colloquial, next to nothing, by the City of Cape Town for that purpose, as an LGBTQIA plus trauma centre and safe space. So what happened under the recent management, which I think began about 2 years ago, when Al Fitra took over, or a year and a half, maybe a little bit more, I started to drive and assist in their access to grant and aid funding from the City of Cape Town. And this is public record. It was in excess of 600,000 Rand, a tranche of funding, to assist with their programs and the running of the shelter.
Yeah.
And, that is one where the city provides the space. We've provided now some funding, and they manage it as they see fit.
Yeah.
But our own safe spaces, where the city, in fact, is on city land. We have Culemborg 1 and 2. We have Penn City, which is underneath the bridge near the Civic Centre. We also have the Belleville Paint City 1, and we're in the process of establishing Paint City 2.
Yeah.
Those all have policies with our service providers that operate them to be well sensitized to LGBTQI plus persons, to even create separate spaces if necessary. We don't want to demarcate a space and force people to go and feel separate. However,
And
if they do,
re-entrench them.
if they do feel vulnerable,
Yeah.
if they request separate accommodation at the safe spaces, we will create that space and be sensitive to their needs.
I mean, I just, before wrapping up, Zach, I mean, I know you used to work as the Shadow Minister for Police.
Yeah.
We spoke a lot about the role of SAPS in this regard. And I mean, a lot of it also has to do with the sensitizing and making SAPS aware of what are some of these things that are happening.
Yes.
Because, somebody might go to a police station and report something, and some of the experiences are horrific. People are turned away, even when it's their last defense.
Yeah.
The South African police can, because of not knowing, even though there is legislation.
Yeah. No. The biggest complaints from queer people about the SAPS is about what's called secondary victimization. So they've already been harassed, assaulted, raped in the more extreme cases, and when they present at the police station to open a case, to open a complaint, to report their assailants, then they are further victimized, harassed, demeaned, and then turned away. So that's a matter of sensitization and training, which, as you say, is provided for, in the prescripts on paper, but it needs to be followed through systemically, consistently, be it in the morning briefings, be it in ongoing, training sessions, etc. And then it needs to be upheld and enforced. So there needs to be accountability enforcement by higher management if anybody does fall foul of that. But then again, I keep coming back to fixing those basics, getting the resourcing, getting the capacity. So, for example, there is provision in SAPS policies for detention cells at police stations to have capacity for trans people who are in custody. But because of the underlying under-resourcing and under-capacity, that can never be followed through, and then you get cases where trans people who are in custody get assaulted because somebody who identifies as a trans woman but who presents physically as male is put with other men in a cell, and then they get assaulted. So it just keeps compounding and being exacerbated.
I also want to say we've got a duty, I think, as South Africa to speak out internationally as well. I mean, as bad as things are here and we've heard some horrific stories, it's a lot worse in many of the other countries on the continent, places like Uganda and Zambia, where it is illegal in Nigeria, where it's illegal. And I think we missed a huge opportunity when Africa chaired the African Union to actually make a stand for rights on the continent as well. And these aren't, you can't separate gay rights from human rights. They're one and the same thing. Gay rights are human rights. And I think that we had a golden opportunity to take the shining light of our constitution into some of the other parts of the continent. It's a pity that the president never used his term of office as the AU chair to drive, not even once, a call for tolerance or the like, leaving many of those people locked in terrible situations where they're murdered, imprisoned, beaten, tortured. It's really quite horrific. Death penalty.
And, you know, quiet diplomacy, John, is not an option when human rights are being violated.
Exactly.
It's just simply, if you're quiet in the face of human rights violation, then you are complicit in it.
And that's why I'm very proud of people like Zach and Mike Waters and Manny de Vries and others who have taken this fight to the Interparliamentary Union. So coming together once a year annually of parliaments around the world. And I'm very proud that it is this party that's placed that these rights on the table for international organizations start dealing with. And it's very uncomfortable for the parliaments of Uganda and Nigeria and Zambia when these things are debated and they try desperately to keep them off the agenda. But we're going to keep pushing away at it because we cannot be free unless all of us are free.
Absolutely.
And that's the fight that we've got to keep on putting on. And it's time that the president, I think, actually put his money where his mouth is, because we hear a lot of talk around taking on the fight against corrective rape, etc. But there's very little specialised policing applied to that problem. And much like the promises around gender-based violence, there's a lot of talk, but very little action.
Yeah. And, no one task team is going to fix this unless you have absolutely committed an entire sort of holistic approach.
A whole of government approach.
Absolutely, where it looks at culture and legislation. Zintle, I'll come to you before we wrap up.
Another thing, I just want us to also remember that the problem is intersectional, It's not just the one-layered problem. It's a problem that I'm a Black woman. It's a problem that I'm queer. It's a problem that, So it's not just one thing that I'm facing. And I just want to make a comment on what Zach just said about the fact that things are there in policy and in paper. However, implementation is not there. For example, there was a queer sex worker who was killed last year in Moorbury police station. And there still hasn't been any accountability in regards to how that trans woman died in that police station. What happened? What were the conditions? So queer people's bodies are disposable. There's no sense of accountability in terms of, okay, if something happens to a queer person, who is going to be there? Who's responsible? What happened? There's no measure of I don't know if I can put it in. There's no way we can measure how people treat members of the LGBT community in those spaces. So then it becomes very difficult for us to, ask for help or to go to a police station, because we know if I go to a police station and I say to a police officer that I was raped, they're going to ask me, what was I wearing? Whereas they should be focusing on the person who raped me and not what I was doing. So almost making it seem like it's my fault, I wanted to get through. Not looking at the perpetrator as the person who committed the crime.
Absolutely.
So these are just some of the things, man, that we, do more about, deal with within our communities, but also in government, because government essentially are the people who have the power to ensure that implementation happens in regards to these particular issues.
Absolutely. We've got to wrap up, and just as closing remarks, now Pride Month is done. Everybody's going to go back to their normal selves, and everybody is just going to forget about some of these conversations that we are having. And as closing remarks from my panelists, what can we do very quickly going forward?
So from our side, I'd like to maybe just take a small opportunity to speak about where we govern, particularly here in the city and in the province.
We'll be discussing it now, actually, Rob.
Are we?
Yeah,
Okay,
we're going to be
fantastic.
discussing it now, where some of the interventions that we've got going on in the city and the government.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Zach?
Look, it's as we've all barely sort of scraped the surface now in our discussion.
Yeah.
It's a big issue, it's a deep issue, it's a complex issue. But I think something that Zintle said gives a sort of clarity and a sort of concreteness about it, is that if everybody can just make an effort to take whatever next step is feasible for them. So if you have a gay or trans colleague, talk to them, sort of share the story, share the reality, and then from there start doing your own sort of reading and research and learning. Because, there was a time when I barely understood, sort of what being transgender was about. But then you learn and you grow, and in that way we can all become sort of more whole human beings, really.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I think that there's a human element to this as well. And I called on South Africa yesterday, particularly during this time, to be kind. I think that before you throw out a slur or you try and discriminate against somebody, just think that, like it is in my case, it could be a member of somebody's family, it's somebody's sister. That this is a human being behind, this label that's being attached to them. A human being with feelings, with emotions, with dreams and aspirations. And I think that, as citizens, we should be lifting each other up to the light, not trying to tread down on each other continuously. And I think that applies in this case as well. I'm very proud of my sister. I'm very proud that she's an incredible wife, mother, sister. And, she is, before you throw it out, just think it could be a member of your family that's being discriminated against. And you wouldn't like to see any of this type of thing happening to a member of your family.
No, absolutely. And I like that. I really like that, prioritize kindness. I think we don't talk enough about being kind in politics. I think we don't talk enough about that. We'll be back after this. And cities across the country. The Auditor General says DA-governed municipalities are the best. Yet again, DA-led Tshwane upgrades the Marabastad informal market, and Hanover Park gets a makeover as DA-governed City of Cape Town installs new roads, new CCTV cameras, and Wi-Fi infrastructure. The DA gets things done. On to this week's DA at Work feature, we'll look at specific interventions by the DA-run City of Cape Town to support the LGBTQIA+ community. Rob, I want to come to you first because I want us to quickly discuss, particularly, we spoke in the last segment about the big problems, but it's incumbent on governments to create an environment where people can feel safe. What are some of the things that are happening, particularly when we're looking at the City of Cape Town?
So the City of Cape Town, for example, and I think it's really important to highlight how important messaging is. And when messaging comes from leadership down into communities, not that there's a hierarchical structure, but if we can start to get it into the minds of our leaders that we have to have a far more inclusionary attitude towards all the residents in our communities. This rainbow flag, which you mentioned in the last segment, only seems to get sort of dragged out of cupboards for 1 month of the year, and maybe over the Cape Town Pride or Joburg Pride or whenever the events take place. But when I came back from a conference in Germany about a year and a half ago, I managed to persuade the DA caucus to consider having a permanent wall banner that lives in our council chamber of a rainbow flag saying that this city stands proudly by its LGBTQIA+ community. And it reinforces that whenever any councillor from any party sits in that chamber, in the seat of local government, that message is there. Its permanent home is in our chamber. I think that's where your first messaging starts immediately, to say that, this is a part of our city's fabric. It's a part of our city's values. And it must extend to all. And there was a very positive response to it. And it's something that this party can be very proud of. Where we govern, we start making these statements loud all the time, not just once a year. In other ways, the city has had a long history of supporting Cape Town Pride. and large LGBTQI events, such as the MCQP parties, Mother City Queer Project. Many of those events themselves funding things like the Pride Shelter with an endowment annually. So, you know, the city will then provide not finances, but a rand value in services.
For the Pride Shelter, like, you know, saying, well, we'll give you accommodation. And, you know.
Exactly. And also for the big events, because remember, those events are big money. They're right up there with the Two Oceans Marathon and the Cape Cycle Tour. That's how big they are in Cape Town.
And it's a great party.
And great parties. If you're young in limbo, not like some of us in this studio.
Hey, listen, I've rocked the 80s dance floor at MCQP a few times.
MCQP is the vibe.
But, you know, it's big rand values in terms of the services, the health and safety compliance certificates and the assessment and the technician that government who does that. The city provides that service to ensure that these events happen, they happen safely, and that they showcase Cape Town as a friend. It's the pink capital of Africa, and we take that in the heart of our government locally as well.
Rob, I also just want to while I'm sticking to you, I mean, the province also, I mean, I know, you know, we don't have somebody here from the province, but I know that the city and the province collaborate quite a lot with some of the work that they do, but the province also does a lot of particularly access to healthcare for people.
So before we jump into health, which is a really lovely story, I think there's one that's also incredibly noteworthy. And from our first segment, it is actually, for me, one of the greatest rays of hope in how do we change mindsets. And that is always, you change a mindset for the future generations by changing the mindset of younger people. And this is not some bizarre gay agenda where people are trying to indoctrinate youth in any way, mind control or whatever else it might be. It simply is the Western Cape Education Department has been incredibly progressive in ensuring that all government schools in this province, the governing bodies, have a policy and an understanding of what LGBTQIA+ is and how to ensure that learners who identify as any of the letters in that acronym, and when we humanize them, because they're people, have the access to education without fear of harassment and in being drafted and included. And I think that is a really positive message from where we govern as province.
And can be themselves. You know.
And I know that Minister Schaefer comes on very heavily when she knows that there's been bullying and that she gets inquiries done to find out why, what, who, to address that if it happens in a government school. And I think that that's a really inspiring hope for the future, happening now already, not a pipe dream that we see with the national LGBTQI task team.
I mean, you know, we have a government that, you know, that is already progressively making these things happen for children. And now we're saying that where we don't govern, regardless of where you are in South Africa, we want to outlaw where children are suffocated in this way. Because as a parent, you want to make sure that your kid goes to a school then where they can be themselves.
Absolutely, that's what you want for your children. You want them to live the life that they want to lead, and say free to be me. And it's terrible to read these tragic stories of these young children at high school level who commit suicide because they can't come to terms with the fact that they are in this oppressive environment that doesn't accept them for who they are. We've got to send the message out there that we love you whoever you are and however you are, and that there's no norm that you've got to conform to. And that we all have an opportunity to identify as who we are and to live the life that we value going forward. So I think it's very, very important, and particularly from the cultural change that we need. It's a tolerance that's required. And that learning that tolerance and teaching that tolerance comes from that early age. Now, as Rob says, you're not running out in schools, trying to convert people, to be homosexuals or something like that, as some of these loonies like to say that we're doing. Well, it's not that at all. It's teaching children to accept and see somebody as a human before you see them as any one of the other labels.
Absolutely.
And I think that if we just adopted that approach, just seeing each other for who we are, before we see a skin color, before we see a sexual orientation, before we see a gender, before we see anything of that, I think South Africa would be a lot better place. And a lot more tolerant, and we wouldn't have some of this abhorrent behaviour taking place. And that starts at a young level.
Exactly, because of course, Zach, if we do it from when you're younger, it kind of prevents situations for when things do go wrong. Absolutely. And as we've seen, as people get, things do go wrong. People get harassed, people get killed. But at least if you target people and teach them tolerance, as John said, it's not about changing morphing children's minds. It's about teaching tolerance, which is deeply entrenched in our constitution.
Yeah, no, and in fact, the way that I would flesh that idea out is that it really comes down to teaching and universalizing 3 core values. It's respect, understanding, and empathy.
Yeah.
It doesn't even have to be necessarily about sexual orientation or gender identity. It's about just as people in communities and schools, in faith communities, whatever it may be, just respect, understanding, and empathy.
Absolutely.
And then at least that's where we can have the dialogue, the conversation, and then build each other up, as John was saying earlier, and not dividing and not sort of pushing people down.
Yeah. And Rob, I mean, from in closing from your side, I mean, there's a whole lot of things I know that we are doing, but I mean, some of them, 1 or 2 key other things that you would think you would like to flag for people who are in need when things do go wrong.
So, just in terms of one of the most fundamental basic human rights, which is access to healthcare. Okay, I think that the Western Cape government is once again, this DA-run government, is leaps and bounds ahead of the pack in terms of other provinces and what we do and our basket of services and partnerships to ensure that LGBTQI people have access in safe space, access to healthcare. The example that I'd like to use here is at the old Somerset Hospital precinct in Greenpoint, not in the hidden away somewhere. It's right in the centre of Cape Town, so to speak, or at the beginning of the Atlantic seaboard. In that old hospital precinct, there is the provincial government CDC or Community Day Centre clinic, and of course then the new Somerset Hospital compound is right next door with all of its state-of-the-art, we're the only province that's not falling apart in terms of health, all of their equipment. The provincial government Department of Public Works, who is the custodian of that site, provided one of the old hospital buildings in the old precinct to the Ivan Tom's clinic for men who have sex with men, years ago already. Now what happens is they have the use of that space from province, and they get a lot of their supplies and support from USAID and Nova Health in the past, and also from the provincial government. So sex workers, a lot of LGBTQI people are sex workers, particularly our trans people, are very nervous about going to sort of state hospitals in fear of judgment, persecution, harassment, etc. So that although we don't operate it, we partner with them to provide the space and support services. They can go, anyone can go there, receive excellent personalized care, and then if there's a need for x-rays, if there's a need for anything else, they are given whatever script they are required from the doctors at that facility to then go to the CDC or the hospital to receive those services.
Except without all the stigma and
without the
all
stigma.
the other nonsense.
It's without the animosity, without fear, and it is a fantastic model of what can be done when a government, provincial government, takes their mandate seriously for all the people that live in their province. And lastly, we are also in our clinics throughout the city-run clinics as well as provincial, especially there's a regular rollout of PrEP or pre-exposure prophylactics, so that those people who, particularly sex workers, or people who are wanting to have that extra security in terms of not picking up HIV/AIDS, we roll that out free. To ensure that people have the best access to quality, life-changing healthcare.
Look, I personally, I'm proud to be part of a party that is liberal enough and progressive enough, even on the continent, to remain sort of a beacon of where we could be going. I know so much more could be done. I know we spoke about some really dark things here today, but I think I'm also just encouraged that, like, at least we are like-minded people who are wanting to continue.
And I'm proud of our public reps from the community, and we've got in Parliament and legislatures and councils who are out there, doing the job. And as Zach said, not just standing up for LGBTQIA rights, but standing up for the comprehensive package of rights of everybody, which is what the DA is trying to do, to bring people from different backgrounds, religious beliefs, sexual orientation, around a common set of values and principles, so that we can all protect each other's rights, whether they are rights to sexual orientation, language rights, cultural rights. All of these things are better protected when we come together around that common set of values and principles.
And we're prepared to have the difficult conversations.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you so much for joining us.
Happy Pride Month.
We'll be right back after this. As we remain locked down in level 4, please remember to look after your health and look after the health of those around you. As Pride Month draws to a close, the fight for equal rights must continue. We cannot limit our activism to just the month of June. It must continue throughout the year. We must do the work within ourselves to confront our own prejudice and change cultures. We must demand more from government too. Until next time, keep it tight, Mzansi.
I am a mother. I am a father. I'm a daughter. I am a son. I am a brother. I am a sister. I am a neighbor. I believe in freedom. Freedom to earn a living, go where I want, love who I want, say what I believe, and pursue my dreams. I am brave. I am a provider. I am whatever it takes. I believe in fairness. A fairness where our achievements are determined by our choices and hard work, not by the circumstances of our birth. I am a leader. I am hopeful. I'm going to beat this. I believe in opportunity. A nation where opportunity is plentiful, where the strong protect the weak, and everyone's rights are protected. I am a helping hand. I am challenging. I am different. I believe in diversity. Every person has a unique perspective and an important role to play in building our nation. We do not judge each other by how we look, but by who we are. We are community. We are South Africans working together for real hope, real change now. We are the Democratic Alliance.